My name is Przemek Bruski. I am the architect for Bamboo. I'm the guy behind Specs. And I want to share some tips on how to effectively use them in your daily development routine. So let's have a look at the agenda. We'll start off briefly discussing configuration as code in general. I'll try to keep it short, but I know that some of you probably have some questions about it, so that's an essential point of the presentation. And now I'll discuss declarative and imperative approaches to defining your plans as code. And then I'll continue with the actual tips. So how do you use specs at scale when you have hundreds of plans under control of specs, maybe several instances, and a lot of people using them. And I close off with some Bamboo Summit highlights, unrelated to specs, but also interesting to some of you. And I'll be taking questions after the talk. Okay, so let's jump into configuration as code. What is configuration as code? I start off by defining the problem that we have when we don't use configuration as code. So within Bamboo, if you're familiar with how we currently define plans, or used to define them prior to shipping configuration as code, you basically had to use the UI. And that meant that at some points you were forced to clone things around, like clone a plan, clone a job. And it works to some extent until you have to modify one of the clones, or maybe potentially all of them. It's just a hassle and a lot of work. The other problem with that approach is black box nature of the whole thing. You can't really version it. You don't see the configuration. You have to click through the whole plan to find what are the most recent changes, what is the current state of the plan. You can version, you can't peer review. It's just unacceptable in current development processes. And finally, no bulk operations. Whenever you wanted to do a simple operation, such as renaming a user or maybe providing a different credentials pair, worst case scenario was that you had to go through all the plans on your instance and just click around and modify them. So that simply doesn't scale. It works, but it doesn't scale. This is where configuration as code comes in. It's essentially means representing the configuration of a system through source code. That's what we shipped. We shipped Bamboo Specs, and it essentially takes a definition of a plan in textual format, sends it off to the server, and creates a plan representation on the server side. So this is what's shipped in Bamboo 6. And a natural question at this point is obviously, okay, so source code, yes, but what language? What should we choose to represent the plan? So this brings us to an interesting debate of declarative versus imperative. There are essentially two approaches to defining a plan. One is declarative, where you essentially lay out certain rules about how your plan should look like, and then interpreter ingests them and creates the plan or whatever configuration you need. The other approach is imperative, where you are more explicit about the things that need to happen. So let's look at the examples. This is a really good example of declarative approach from Bitbucket Pipelines, where you essentially declare a couple of things. You declare an image that you would like to use for your build, and a script that needs to be run. Nothing else. It has some obvious advantages. This is very compact, has flat learning curve. The language is simple. There are only a couple of rules around it, and you can use standard tools to edit your configuration, including in-browser editors. But it all comes at a price, and the price is scalability. So if you have 700 plans, you essentially end up having 700 YAML files, and good luck editing them manually. Reuse is a problem. So if you want to use some common entities, such as set of scripts or credentials, it could be a problem. The other thing is validation. As I mentioned, you only have a couple of rules around YAML, how to build it, and you can validate that, but you can't validate the semantics of the things you put into your configuration. Which brings us to the other approach, which is imperative. So this is an example from Bamboo Specs. It's a Java-like language that you can use to define your plans. It's not that complicated. As you can see, you set up a project, set up a plan with a description, with some stages and jobs. These are all familiar concepts to anyone who has been working with Bamboo. Because it's Java-based, you also get syntax completion and other goodies. And the major thing here, because at this stage it actually does look quite similar and maybe not that more powerful than the YAML file, but you can have loops, work if conditions, and things like that directly in your plan definition. So advantages: it does scale better, a lot better. You can reuse components, and a component can be a job, a script task, a set of tasks, anything. You can just have people who will prepare a really good definition that you want to reuse across your whole company and make it available to everyone in their plans. It integrates with tools really well. So you get documentation, syntax completion, refactorings, validation directly in the IDE that you're using. But again, everything comes at a cost. And the cost in this case is, well, it is harder to start. We try to make it as easy as possible, but we can't make it any easier. The learning curve is slightly worse, especially if you're a non-Java user. You will have to get accustomed to the syntax a bit. And finally, something that's not essentially, maybe not a disadvantage, but I had to mention it here. If you start managing a lot of plans with specs, the result will be complex. It will be a maintainable representation of your instance, but it will be a big definition. So this brings me to a statement that we had at Barcelona Summit. Powerful definition languages are the easiest way to manage a big CI instance. And in Barcelona, we stopped at that. We basically said, yeah, if you have a big instance, you need to use specs. But then we realized, and our customers were really helpful in making us understand that on every big instance, you actually have small teams. And if you have several thousand developers working on an instance, you can have some big teams and some people who have a library that they work on, and they don't need the complexity that specs brings at all. So for this reason, in 6.2, which is about to ship this month, we are adding support for ingesting Bitbucket Pipelines configuration files, which are simple YAML files you can write directly in Bitbucket server, in browser edit, and just plan away. And this is how it looks when you commit that plan and view it in Bamboo. So if you would like to see more about this particular feature, there is a demo then at 2, where I'll be live demoing how that actually works. Okay, so this brings us to the main topic of the presentation, which is the actual tips. From a bit more than 10, but not that many, so I won't bore you. Don't worry. But at this stage, it's also very important to mention why I am the person who, or why are we the people who are telling you how you could use Bamboo specs. It's not because we have written them. It's because we listened to customers who have been using them and acted on that feedback, introduced some shortcuts, some improvements into specs. And we also stole a lot of tips directly from Jira guys who are using configuration as code sorry, to great extent. Okay, let's start with tip number 1. So everyone who hates specs because of Maven and Java, if you can get away with using YAML, please do. It's a good format, we admit that. It's simple. We consider it to be a gateway to specs. So at some point, we assume that you will want to switch to something more powerful. And the best thing is you get containers for free. So the whole build you're running is fully containerized. It's fully isolated. You can run package installation in there. You can leave processes behind your build. You don't have to clean up. The container will go away, and everything will be cleanly prepared for next build. The other tip I would have for you is never write specs. Never start writing specs on your own. Use a generator. We've shipped a generator together with Bamboo, which basically, using one click, you can create a template for your plan from an existing plan that you have. I know it's a hard thing to start with specs, So don't do it. Let Bamboo jumpstart your spec for you. So this is how it looks like. You basically have to go to configuration of a plan, view plan as Bamboo specs. That's it. You get the specs that should run right away. Another tip that I would have for you is script tasks. So in the past, we've used tasks as a building block for your plans, and it works well. It represents the plan really nicely in the UI. It's a good approach. But with configuration as code, we are not in the UI anymore. We have a configuration that's essentially textual. So in many cases, the task would be a thin wrapper that unnecessarily wraps a Maven command or an AND command. And in this case, it's probably best to avoid them, because then you can directly use the script task, for example, when you want to run your builds locally. Tip number 4, especially when you're starting your work with specs, it's sometimes very hard to tell which actual changes you want. You know what you want, but you don't know how to express it. So it's a very bad approach to ship your spec and override everyone's plans and maybe create some redness on your wallboards. That's why we came up with a dry run where you would send a disabled plan to the server into a separate place, and then you can have a look at whether your spec change actually did what you wanted. This obviously works with Maven and IDE, and also in the repository stored mode, about which I will talk a bit later. And this is how a plan would look like after you dry run it. It's exactly the same as a normal plan. It's stored in a separate project in a disabled state, and you can click around, see whether the configuration is exactly as you wanted it to be. Tip number 5, continuing the topic of how can you make sure that the changes that you made into the spec are actually what you wanted. Reviews. Whenever you make a spec change, because it's so powerful, you could end up modifying hundreds of plans potentially. This is obviously not a drawback of specs. This is why we're using specs. We want to be able to manage plans at scale. The problem is that when a reviewer has a look at your small change, he has no impact, or she has no idea on the impact it has on your instance. So for this reason, Jira people came up with the idea of storing YAML files, which are mapped one-to-one with your plans. And then if you make a change that affects 600 plans, you will end up with having 600 modified files. Obviously, you don't need to look at them all, but at least you get an idea of what the change actually does. Now, it's probably a worst case kept secret. Specs are actually mapped to YAML. So we are actually sending YAML files over REST, which means we can also generate them locally. If you use a special switch, you can store your YAML files locally and include them in the review. Another tip that I would have for you is variables and credentials. So in the past, where UI was the only way of configuring your plans, you would use variables or shared credentials to introduce some kind of shared entities into your plans. It's no longer needed because you have Java, so you can define variables directly in your code. And it's versioned, peer-reviewed, and in general moves the state from server, which is a bit of a black box, into your source code repository. And a natural question at this point would be, how do I deal with credentials? So with Bamboo 6, we've introduced instance-wide encryption, and you can use that encryption in your credentials as well, which means that even if someone checks out your code with your credentials, you won't be able to decrypt them. The only entity that can encrypt them is your Bamboo server. Tip number 8, find build champions. This is really not that much related to Spec itself, but related to how we think you should manage your instance. So at scale, once you have more and more plans with dependencies and with different schedules, it becomes a big problem to actually manage that. If everyone does it, then really nobody does it. So it's really good to find a person or people who will define policies, tiers for plans, who will essentially manage the definition. It's much easier with specs and actually moves the threshold of where you start to need that champion. But this is a tip that actually applies even if you use UI-driven configuration only. What's very important is that it's not a fixed red build role, right? Don't conflate these two things. Empower your champion, make sure that he's the one to define the policies and doesn't chase people who broke a build. And as I said, it's going to happen anyway. So if you're using UI, YAML, or specs, it's just a matter of threshold. Maybe with UI, you will need it at 50 plans. Maybe with specs, you will need it at 100 plans. OK, tip number 8. Once your number of plans grows, your CI is going to be a constant battle against flakiness. If you look at the presentations from Google, they mentioned insane amounts of tests they are running and insane amount of flakiness. Flakiness are really good because they very often show you a bug in your code that's related to concurrency, and you need to fix it. So how do we cope with it? If you have 50 plans, all of them on dashboard, the wallboard is constantly red. The idea that we came up with was organizing them into tiers. So instead of fighting with all of them, we said, OK, these are the really important plans, these are the slightly important plans, and these are the least important plans. And we assigned to them policies such as this has to be always green, this has to be green close of business, this has to be green before the sprint end. Obviously, it's up to you to define your own policies, and this is just an idea of how you could do it. But tiering plans works, unless you're Jira and you have really a lot of plans. So what Jira ended up doing is they merged the plan into one mega plan that gives them a consistent view on the CI system. If that plan is green, everything is green. It's a lot harder to maintain the kind of discipline required to have that mega plan, but it does pay off because it's just one plan, it's green, we can ship. This is how it looks for Jira. So, or actually, how it looked like before we started using this mega plan. So they essentially have project per tier, and we have different sort of SLAs associated with each tier. Number 9. This one is really difficult to explain. So let's assume that you have a master branch and a couple of release branches, let's say 2. What you would normally be doing with release branches, they are probably in maintenance mode. So you're very unlikely to build new features for them, but you're quite likely to ship bug fixes for them. Now, if you put all your releases as standard feature branches within Bamboo, you end up having a mix and a mashup of all branches destined for different releases in a single combo box. So this is a problem for Jira. And the idea we came up with, they actually started creating separate projects for every release they shipped. And in that project, they not only have just the branches they need for that release, they also have separate plan lists. So, which is another natural thing that happens. If you shipped something 2 years ago, chances are that the plans you're using right now don't really apply to version which is so old. So this is how it looks for Jira. In 7.4, they have a set of plans, and that's a project, 7.4 project. And the 7.4 stable has a different project with a different set of plans. And as you can see, also the branches we are showing there are related to that release only. So we no longer have a mix-up of several feature branches for several releases in one Dropbox. Now, this is obviously possible with UI-driven plans as well, but specs make it a lot easier because you can organize your plans and orchestrate them into projects. If the plan is the same, you basically use the same plan in a different release. If it's different, you can use a different plan, a different definition. Tip number 10, template your organization. Another rather hard to explain concept. So the current trends basically move away. The software development in general moves away from having huge monolithic projects. We typically have smaller ones, call them microservices, libraries, projects, plugins, whatever. It's the same thing. You end up having a lot of smaller repos that basically decompose your bigger problem into something more manageable. Now the question is, how do you ensure consistency between all these projects? And there can be a number of answers to this. One of is obviously you can prepare some specs that you will be able to use and give to teams. You can also prepare some templates, which essentially would be a spec that you launch against, you start against the server, and from then on the team takes it over and they only do UI-driven configuration. There's also another approach that some of our customers took, and that is they actually created their own YAML format based on specs. So what it actually does is you have a simple file with, let's say, 3 entries: pre-built, built, and post-built, and they parse it, create a spec out of it, send it to the server, and that's it. So the users interact only with the YAML, and everything else is managed by people who define policies for the organization, which is pretty powerful. We have one customer who already did it, and one who intends to do it. It's a job for an intern. It's really so simple, using specs as a library or an API to build your own formats. This is also how we introduced support for Bitbucket Pipelines format. Sorry, this was a result of one of our hackathons called Ship It. You probably heard about it at the summit. Okay, tip number 11, AnyTask. So AnyTask is a bit hard to use unless you use Exporter, when it's very easy. AnyTask can essentially mimic a real task defined in specs. If you have a custom task that you have written, which is quite simple, or you have downloaded from the marketplace, then we don't know about it. Specs doesn't support it. But with the help of AnyTask, you can actually make it work. So you can use AnyTask and spec away your build, even if you use custom task. The way you should be using it, obviously you can write it from scratch, but again, we don't think it's a good idea. A better approach is to use Exporter, and Exporter will create a definition of your AnyTask directly. As you can see, it's quite complicated because it deals with the configuration internals of a task. But if you export it, you end up with this, and you can introduce some parameters to it, wrap it around with a method in specs, and that will work for you. So this would be it. But I have one more thing, and that thing is specs for Bitbucket Server. So this is something that we are launching this month. It essentially lets you store your specs in a repository, and instead of sending them via REST every time you run them, rely on Bamboo Server to react on the changes in the repo directly. That maybe doesn't sound as that big of a breakthrough, but if you consider what it actually offers, is you have full traceability because you enforce all your changes through Bitbucket to go through the Bitbucket Server repository, which means you have access to workflows because you can enforce pull requests if you choose to. It gives you full and perfect audit log, including access to full history, and so on and so on. So it basically, the promise that we made in Barcelona that we're going to make your configuration as code look as actual code, and that you will be able to put it under your software development cycle is now fulfilled. Thank you. So how does it look like? You don't actually need to learn a lot of new things. You can use your existing spec project that you used to run against your Bamboo server and store it in your repository in the Bamboo specs directory. We don't make any restrictions on where you actually put it. You can store it together with your code, or you can store it in a separate repo. You can also store it in multiple repos, and you can also mix it with Bitbucket Pipelines YAML files. So from our perspective, it's all good, and it's up to you to decide which of these approaches is best. In my opinion, a mix of all these approaches is actually the best, because then you'll be able to have a central repo which manages most of the instance and still give people the power to define their own plans in smaller repositories. Enabling Bamboo to work with specs is super easy. There's a new tab on repository configuration menu. If you tick off this checkbox, Bamboo will start looking at the repository and scanning it for specs. You can also restrict the repository to only access certain projects. You may want to have it for compliance reasons, for example. Again, if you'd like to see a demo of that feature, I'll be demoing it, the demo then at 2:10, I think, today. And this is a result, right? So after we commit the change to a plan, we end up having a very similar UI as we usually did. So we can have a look at the commit, have a look who did it, why, and what is the actual content of it on the Bitbucket server. That's it. So I don't have any more tips for you, but if you'd like to ask some questions about specs, we'll be at the booth. I have some more highlights for you. So things that we are also shipping, because the world in the end doesn't end with specs. We're shipping product level permissions, which was a highly requested feature by pretty much every enterprise out there. You no longer need to delegate your admin permissions at the instance level, which is a really bad practice, but unfortunately it was necessary. You right now can define product admins. We've made a lot of performance improvements because we're shipping new tiers. A new biggest tier will be a 1,000 agent tier, and we need to make a lot of work to performance-related work to actually have a stable instance at that level. The other thing we're shipping is artifact handlers, which basically means that you can no longer need to rely on your Bamboo server to store your artifacts. You can spread them around on S3 or NFS. And finally, we're also shipping smart mirrors, another feature related to distribution and scalability, where you will be able to use your Bitbucket server data center edition to serve just the traffic from the agents. And so the agents will no longer affect the development work of your developers. And that's it. So thank you very much.